I would like to call our meeting to order. Could we all stand for the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. First of all, with my bad manners, Happy New Year. Glad to see everyone in the new year. Hope everyone had a safe and beautiful holiday and enjoyed family, enjoyed traveling, or doing whatever you had to do to just relax. And then we will have a roll call.
Richard Hawley,
Here.
Richard Janelli,
Here.
Juanita,
Here.
Kate,
Here.
Al,
Here.
Michelle,
Here.
Terry,
Present.
Mary, Gladys,
Here.
Lauren,
We have 10 present and 1 absent. Thank you. I would like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. This is a budget workshop. Okay. And I'm going to ask you, when you have a question, would you raise your hand? I will put you on my list, and when you ask your question, I will scratch you off and move on to the next person. We're going to be polite, understand this budget workshop, ask your questions, so we can be out of here at 8 o'clock. No questions then. Yes, Mr. Janelle.
Do we ask, Kevin, do you want the questions held until after or as you go
Please.
through the slides?
Please, if we can wait until the end of the presentation, and since everyone has already heard the presentation, I'll go through it very relatively quickly to make sure John and I have plenty of time at the end for questions.
Okay,
That'll
thank
be
you.
helpful. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I know I can tease Mr. Janelle. Any other questions before we get started? Okay. Mr. Walsh, you want to do the slide, right?
Yes.
Okay. Cut this off. And I'll move on to work.
John is here this week.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome back our common board members and new board members to the 2024 school year. And so in front of you this evening and on our screen is our preliminary budget for the 24-25 school year. I did have an opportunity to review the preliminary budget with our new board members in the month of December in 2 separate evenings, and I want to thank them for taking the time to join John and I that night. And of course, I want to thank the board in November. Of course, we had the opportunity to review this previously. So this will be our first opportunity as a group to ask some clarifying questions and frankly, just kind of nail down any questions that you might have going into the full presentation for January 10th. And so on page 2, which is titled Budget Timeline, it's this right here.
You want me to move?
That's good.
Graphic.
And the budget timeline, you will see, I just want to bring your attention to the line that says January. These are really the activities for the month of January from my office, of course, also with our Chief Finance Officer, John Spang. And that is, of course, Board of Ed workshop, which is this evening. I anticipate we may have a couple of extra for the month of January or February as well. Of course, we will have a Finance Committee meeting in the month of January, a Board of Ed meeting, which hopefully there'll be an opportunity to adopt the budget. If not in January, then in February, certainly. Parents as Partners budget discussion is in an alumni group from one of our parent university groups that I'll be also reviewing the budget with that group that I cannot get to in December. And last but not least, the NEA Superintendent Advisory Overview. That was initially planned for December, but we had a full agenda that afternoon, and so that has been pushed to January. So that's why that is now in the month of January as an activity. And I will just leave the other items for your review. You'll see February February Board of Ed workshop if needed. Budget templates due to the city, typically by no later than February 14th. And then, of course, an adopted budget by the board will be submitted to the mayor's office in City Hall by that time as well. And so our next slide begins to tell the story here in Danbury Public Schools. And so the enrollment, you'll see all of the blue bars. The blue bars represent the numbers dating back to 2017-18, and you'll see enrollment growth in the city of Danbury Public Schools, a little over 11,400 students in 17-18, and as of our October 1 submission in 23-24, we had 12,114 students reported to the state of Connecticut. Since October 1, we have added an additional 91 families, students I should say, to the district. And so the year to date, as of today, is 12,205. That red bar represents our projection for the 24-25 school year based on our demographic projections. The next slide is titled Enrollment Growth, and this represents our enrollment growth not only for our multilingual learners, but also our special education students. These last two slides really begin to speak to how different and unique we are from the other districts in the entire state of Connecticut. And so you have heard me say considerably often and often how we continue to experience growing enrollment here in Danbury Public Schools, while the vast majority of the districts across the state of Connecticut are experiencing flat or declining enrollment. Another thing that further distinguishes us from the rest of the districts in the state of Connecticut is our continued growth amongst our multilingual learners. By far, we have the highest percentage in the entire state of Connecticut, and despite the fact we are the 6th largest district in the state of Connecticut, we by far have more multilingual learners. To date, we have 4,468. We've already grown 116 since October 1. This next slide, titled Requested versus Actual. And this just kind of gives a historical look back, going back to 17-18, and just kind of walking the board through what the ask had been from the Board of Ed to the city, and what the actual funding was from the city of Danbury. So going back to 17-18, the request was 131+ million. We received 128 million. And you see every year, 135 million was the request or the need. The next year was 132 million. Going from left to right, you will see the columns as such: school year, Board of Ed need or request, actual funding, the difference, and the ongoing enrollment growth. For your slide this afternoon, which is different from what you had seen previously, I did not have a projection for 24-25. It stopped at 23-24. So I wanted to make sure 24-25 represented the Board of Ed need or request. The actual funding, of course, is empty, and the difference is empty because we don't know what the city funding is going to be at this time. However, what I did include, and you'll see the two asterisks, 12,304 is the number we expect to be at the minimum by the opening of school in September 24-25 school year. The big difference, of course, I wanted to bring your attention to, and that is the $45 million over since 17-18. That has been the gap that we have experienced in terms of what we've asked for and what we have received from the city of Denver. The next slide, page 6, and that is the cliff. And the cliff is an excerpt from our 2022 budget book, where we were beginning to, or trying to forecast not only what the 24-25 ask might be, but also to demonstrate to the community how our funding streams are beginning to change in subsequent years. And so again, going from left to right, you'll see fiscal year 21-22, 22-23, 23-24, 24-25, 25-26. And then if you look at the column, going from ESSER 3, ESSER 2, CARES Act, those are the three COVID relief monies that we received starting in 21-22 school year during the pandemic. Alliance, of course, Title I, IDEA, and other grants are sustainable grants that we've continued to receive. And city funding, of course, is our funding from the city of Danbury. And so you'll see at the bottom it says total funding, and that's essentially, and this is something I want to speak to later on in the presentation, but total funding is essentially what it takes to run and operate the District of Danbury Public Schools. I'll stay here for a second, John. In 24-25, you will see ESSER 3, ESSER 2, and CARES Act a zero. That zero is there really to strongly and represent the cliff that we have been so concerned about these last 3 or 4 years. We've benefited from the COVID monies, the relief monies, because it has helped to address enrollment growth over the last couple of years. And so it has essentially filled the gap that the city has not filled, and it has also filled the gap, to be fair, for the Alliance funding that was not fully funded at that time, right? And so we have been a beneficiary of those monies, and we are now in a place where now that those monies have dried up, you will hear later on throughout the presentation and our subsequent presentations, the vast majority of the monies in ESSER 3 are staffing for Danbury High School to address our enrollment growth over these last couple of years. So when we initially, again, when we put the budget book together for 2022, you see an Alliance projection. Again, this was a projection at that time. In 2024-25, we tried to do essentially about a $2 million increase. We will report later on that that increase is projected to be higher. Again, this is an excerpt straight from the book. Title I at $3.8 million during this year, and projecting that will be at about $3.9 million. Again, those numbers change depending on enrollment in the district. IDEA grant, 2.8, projecting at 2.9. Other grants we flat funded, not knowing what would be continuing to come into the system. So we just flat funded that at $34 million. The number I want to bring your attention to, the funding need for $150 million for 23-24, you'll see that for city funding, $150. And then you'll see an asterisk next to $169 million, and I want to talk about what that number represents. That $169 million, again, was a projection around November, December, when we were putting together the budget book in 2022. Frankly, the number is not terribly off from what we see those projections to be now. This $169 million represents our Keep the Lights On maintenance budget from 23-24 to 24-25. It also includes absorbing the ESSER salaries from 23-24 to 24-25. So that gets us to the $169 million. The $169 million does not include the new ask for the 24-25 school year, because it did not assume or anticipate enrollment growth in this budget book. So I think when we did the math, this was off by about $2 million in total. But we came pretty close to what we had projected at that time when we were trying to forecast what the district would look like 2 to 3 years out. So I just wanted to give you an idea how we got to the 169. Again, it's folding in the salaries from ESSER 3, and then it's also to keep the lights on budget, keep all of the programs and services in place, roll over contracts, and try to project what utilities and transportation costs would look like. That's how we got to the 150 to the 169. And so that's what you're seeing on this page from this excerpt from the budget book. The next slide, ongoing budget drivers and mandates. This is just a quick review and overview. IT upgrades and supports, and I know I shared this with our new board members and also city board members. We had several grants to support one-to-one device activity for all of our students in the district. Those federal and state grants have since expired, and this is now an initiative that we are funding here locally in the city of Danbury. The 25 credits to graduate, this is not a new initiative, but it does come as an ongoing cost for us, and I think at some point we'll have to stop saying it, but it is part of our reality. 21 credits to graduate for students to 25 costs more money, costs more classes, more teachers, etc. And then, of course, that's exacerbated by the fact that we continue to experience additional enrollment. SEL support in staff, post-pandemic, we have learned. Of course, we were, prior to the pandemic, we were desperately trying to catch up, making sure that we can address the NEASC request to make sure we've satisfied our ratio of 325 or less students per guidance counselor at the high school as possible. We've been able to reduce that ratio over the last couple of years. In most cases, this has essentially been with extra monies, but it also helps us to address social emotional challenges and the supports that we need across the system. So we have been able to, the majority of our investments have been in guidance, but we've also been able to hire some psychologists and social workers across the system, but more continues to be needed, and those requests continue to come and impact the system. School safety enhancements, of course, we can't have a building of 3,900 students in the building and not continue to request additional advocates at the high school, so that this incorporates that ongoing request. The board might also recall we had requested and acknowledged the request with an additional advocate also for every middle school as well. In addition, we are seeking out this rapid grant, which requires an investment on the Board of Ed side. And so this is, again, this is a school safety enhancement. And I'll ask Mike to, at a follow-up meeting through facilities, to talk about the rapid program, because I know some of our new board members are not necessarily aware. Special education population increases and ELA population increases. I've talked about the MLO community and the supports needed for that population. I think it's important to know, although we haven't experienced the same type of student growth with our special ed students, but the needs of the students have changed considerably. And so the services and supports have changed, which could mean more counseling, more OT, more PT across the system. Last but not least, the new ARC reading program. I know a lot of our sitting board members have heard quite a bit about the new reading program. But the new reading program will transition next year for the 24-25 school year. That transition will start in the spring with grades 4 and 5. And so new materials have already been purchased for that group. And then professional development plan will be implemented to help support that transition for the following year. But the point being, it continues to require an ongoing investment for the implementation of it. And then last but not least, and I think this last bullet, quite frankly, is something we'll be talking about in this room for a long time, because it's something we've been talking about for a long time, and that is enrollment growth. It's just, I think it's always going to be a budget driver for this district and community. So these next 3 to 4 slides, John Spang is going to speak to, and it's talking about our budget drivers, and then he's also going to have a summary slide in addition to that as well. John.
I think, Kevin, I'm going to stand up because I'm going to point to a couple of those slides if it's okay. People hear me okay? Can you hear me back there? Okay. So you have a page in your book, it's called Budget Drivers, and there's a lot going on this page. I want to take a minute and walk through. I know it may look kind of small, it's easier to see in your book, but what it talks about is what we're calling contract obligations and program maintenance. And what that means is this is the budget for our existing programs and services, what we have right now, what it would cost next year without anything new, just the things we're doing today. I think that's an important first step to really understand what we're requesting. So what you see in the first 2 columns, though, they should be familiar. And it's the middle column, though. I'd like to take a minute and just point something. First of all, let me back up. The numbers are different from what you saw last month. Last month, what we had prepared was what we call a pro forma budget. A pro forma budget is more of a summary nature. We might take what we have for supplies and say they're going up 6% for inflation, or the teacher contract is 5%, so salaries are going up 5%. You do some general things with the larger line items. For example, you know what the bus contract is and so on. But since then, we've actually done more of a zero-based budget. We've gone item by item, line by line. We took individual teachers and said, what step will they be on next year? What lane will they be in? What insurances have they picked? Have they picked single or family? We looked at what the principals actually wanted for supplies and put that in. Maybe they wanted fewer textbooks and more library books or something like that. Looked at everything much closer. And when we did what we can now call the preliminary budget, it's come down from what you saw last month. Last month, you would have seen a figure of 163 million up there. That's now come down to 160. Sometimes we call it the lights on budget, but what brought it down? Really a couple things. One is we had a recommendation from our employee benefits consultant, the Gallagher Company. We've used them for a long time. They recommended a 5.5% increase in health insurance for next year. The pro forma budget had been predicting 7. So when we worked that in, worked out the individual choices, that came down more than $1 million. The other thing we saw that came out different was, I'll call them as energy costs. A year ago, the outlook for energy prices was not good. We all saw our electric bills going up, us just like you going up. Everything was going high, inflation was going higher, and we had to budget a significant increase. That was one of our drivers last year, was energy costs. But since then, energy costs have come down, and we've been able to lock in some of our prices along with the city in sort of a cooperative venture. If you know the purchasing agent, Chick Volpe, he'll go out to bid on some of these things when they think the market is favorable. They'll ask us, do we want to join in? Gives them a bigger quantity. So we've locked in some lower energy prices for next year already that are lower than we had in the budget. So when we put it together this month, it came down a few $100,000 there. So that, along with the actual payroll costs and things like that, the lights on budget or the current programs and services is lower than what you saw last month. But what I'd like to show you here is particularly the 23-24 budget, because there's been well, I'm sure we'll be talking about the requests we have in front of the city, the savings we thought we'd have last year and didn't have. But what I'd like to show you is, for these line items, and we'll call those, I like to call them major objects. That's the word they use in governmental accounting. You can see that the items that we plan to spend, which go right down to the $318,000, the dues, fees, and staff development, we've projected those. So we're projecting 153 million next year, up to 160. So it's you can see some of these individual ones are really not going up substantially higher. The entire budget, if you look from 160 to 150, that's going up less than 7%. Okay, so a couple things in here to point out. I call it last year, this year. We lost ESSER 2, the second of the 3 COVID grants. That expired last June. We had a number of staff that were in ESSER 2, if you remember, mostly, again, at the high school. And we moved those staff into the school budget. And when we did it, we wanted to highlight it so people could see exactly what we were doing. We didn't want to blend it in with the current staff who are in the budget. So we put it on this line right here that said enrollment impact equipment, $5.5 million. You can see that doesn't extend into the next year they're now up in the salary numbers. It helps explain why that 92 million is significantly higher, but it's not a change for next year. The 5.5 million actually, what was in that was 4.5 million for expiring SR2 and some repairs to our buildings, call them minor repairs that we do, things the city doesn't do. There's about 700,000 there. So that's one of the changes. The other thing I think you need to know is we're going to make, when we come back next week, we're going to show this a little differently. For a lot of years, we have budgeted for our tutors, our special ed tutors, not in the salary lines. We've budgeted them up here and purchased professional services. It's about $4 million of salaries that are on that line, been there a long time. So what we're going to show you next week, we're going to move $4 million up into the salaries where it belongs. But we're going to do a restatement. So we're not just going to move next year's up, but we're going to move this year's up. So you'll see 4 million less on the purchase professional services line this year and next year, and 4 million more on the salaries this year and next year. We think it's a more transparent way to show our budget. It is salaries. We're gonna do that. Okay, so that's the preliminary budget. As Kevin explained, and I don't know if many of you happened to read the article in the Hearst newspapers on Monday, New Year's Day. You know, they do these top 10 stories all the time, but they wrote a story about what would be the top 10 news stories to watch this year. And one of the ones in the middle was what, in their words, was the fiscal cliff. Exactly what we're talking about. That was their term. And they talked about how to keep our eye on what's going on in Hartford. The changes would be significant, not just next year, but in the years that follow. So I thought that was interesting timing. So this is really the story of our budget this year. It has different names. The Hearst newspapers called it pandemic era grants. It's already an era, right? Pandemic era grants. We call them the COVID grants. The state ed department calls them ESSER grants, all the same thing. There were 3 of them, as you saw on Kevin's slide. The first one they called the CARES Act, a couple $1 million. The second one was called ESSER 2, and the third one ESSER 3. But the first one was a couple million. The second one was $12 million. That's expired. And the third one was $25 million. Back in 2021, the board said, well, let's split that over 3 years kind of equally. This is the 3rd year. It runs out in June. We did a little better. Instead of having only $8 million to spend at the end of the 3rd year, we had $10.5 million left. But if we had the grant for another year, the people that are in it, primarily teachers, would cost us $10.7 million to just do the same thing next year. You can see it's almost $7 million in salaries, the usual employee benefit package. But what we've also done in that grant is we've paid for substitute teachers in that grant. And you know, like most organizations with COVID and some of the labor shortages, it's been very hard to fill all of our absences, or I should say harder than before the pandemic. We use an outside service like many school districts to hire our subs, but that activity is in the ESSER 3 grant today. So we need to continue that. So again, this is, I call it the story of the budget this year, the declining ESSER 3, the last of the COVID grants. That will add to that lights on budget you saw in the previous slide. Now, if you want to go to the next one, Kevin, there are a lot of other things going on, and let me just go through those briefly. These are new things to the budget, so sticking with that approach, we think showing you the new things separately is a good way to go, because it makes sense. We need to highlight these new things for you. In special education, we have a growing need at all levels, K to 12, for additional staff, including at the pre-K level. And yes, there's a new mandate up to age 22, but we need special ed support staff pre-K through 12. So we think that's 400,000 next year. But the Cardis building, the academy, we believe that will be ready for occupancy on April 1st. And we'd like to move in on April 1st. We don't think we can wait till July to move in if school's going to start in August up there. So what we're proposing is some salaries for administration and operations. We don't quite know all the specifics of that. Plans are still being developed. But we're going to need some administration for both the high school and the middle school programs that will be housed over there. Now, whether it's 2 people for half a year, or 2 people and a secretary, or 1 person for longer than that and an admin assistant, we'll have more details on that. But there's a lot of work that has to be done when you open a school. All the little things, you've heard the devil's in the details, and there are a number of things. The building committee's doing a fantastic job, but they handle the big things. And there'll be a lot of little things, not just buying things, but scheduling and arranging and getting ready that has to be done that takes time. So we see the need for new administrative staff to be housed there in April. Those positions carry employee benefits. But we'll also be responsible for the building at that point. The city actually turns it over to us, and we have to budget for the cost of running that building. It's a big building. This has been, I have to be honest with you, I described it as the most difficult line item to project this year. For those of you who went through the tour over there, it was nothing in there really to go on, so it's very hard. We'll try and get better numbers as we get closer. But what that number is based on is the cost to operate our current high school, but for 3 months. So we'll do better with that, I think. I want to point that out. We'll need some supplies and things like that to get going over there for a couple months. Most of the expense for the academy will come in the following budget, but there'll be some things there. Also new, if there was a silver lining in the pandemic, it was that it pushed all of us into more technology. We're doing more with systems, computers, things like that, especially in our classrooms. And when you go down that path, you have to support it. To keep going, we're going to need more infrastructure, more devices, more support, just to keep it running all the time. We think that cost will be about $785,000 next year. And that, unfortunately, will be an ongoing expense of, education today and its emphasis on technology. But in here, I think this is probably the second most important driver of the budget after the ESSER 3. And I describe it this way. The building, the Cardis building has been delayed for a year from its original estimates. And nothing wrong with that. Instead of occupying it in August of '24, it's August of '25, or April 25. And of course, we can't move during a school year. But just because the building's not ready, that doesn't mean the students aren't here. The students are coming. They're here already. If you talk with Principal Donovan, he'll tell you that when he looks at the 8th grade, the 9th grade, the 10th grade, and 11th grade, right now, it's close to 3,900 kids. And we knew the enrollment would be here. We thought we'd have the building, but we don't. So what we are going to need for next year is more teachers at our high school. The high school has asked for 9 what they call core classroom teachers, 9 core classes, and 5 electives, total of 14 certified teachers. That's the $1,050,000 right there. And the benefit packages that go with those 14 positions are right underneath that. Now, you saw from us earlier, and we'll talk about this a little bit, academies and the cost of that, what that would cost. This will be a reduction of that. We need them now. We won't need them a year from that. But also with the enrollment growth, we need more buses. Some of you have been up there, up to high school in the morning or at dismissal. The buses are full. There are tons of kids on them. And this represents 4 additional buses added to our current fleet. They cost about $75,000 a year per bus. And the other part of that, what we call the enrollment adjustments furniture, that's nothing more than just student desks and chairs for new students. And the ones we have don't last forever. Sometimes they break, they have to be replaced. But we need student furniture for the increased enrollment. So that's in the middle there. That's a big driver. We want to do more with school security. We always want to do more. There's some grants that we can get if we pay a share of that. We'd also like to add more safety advocates next year. So we've put that in as a budget driver. And then finally, as you saw Kevin's slide, our increase in multi-language learners that we have some, we call them academic support staff and the benefit package. I'm just going to read these off to you at the high school. 4 bilingual teachers, 2 Spanish, 2 Portuguese, to teach science, math, and social studies. 4 bilingual paras, 2 Spanish, 2 Portuguese, and a SIOP coach for the high school. We also think we need 2 more bilingual paras, 1 Spanish, 1 Portuguese, K-5, 2 for the district, and a SIOP coach there. And then at the middle schools, world language teacher at Rogers Park and at Broadview, 2 middle school teachers for world language. So those are the drivers. Kevin, if you want to go to the next one, just kind of summarizes it. That's how we got to the 175. The 160, which you saw in the first slide, declining COVID relief funds adds 11 million. Here are the new items that I just walked through. When you add those together, it's 175 million. That's 25 million over the 150 that we're currently operating with. Is that the last one for me?
Yes. That's the last one, John.
All right. Yep.
And I have two more slides, and I will go through these quickly. The next slide is titled Next Steps for January 10th meeting. And just kind of want to walk you through some initial next steps that we were planning for our, not preliminary budget, but budget presentation for 24-25. So one, I just want to reiterate something that John had said previously. The tutors will be moved from purchase professional services into salaries and benefits on slide 8. Our new board members might recall this conversation, but I also want to remind our sitting board members, we had talked about potentially what moving costs could cost the district for moving this building, CRC, which is our curriculum building across the street, 43 Beaver Brook, which is down the block. And we'll also hope to backfill this building with one of our programs. And so all of those moves we are estimating to be at around $100,000 to have professional movers plus the payment for overtime for staff and also our custodial staff overtime. And when I say staff, I mean contractually we have to pay staff and pay them a couple of days for actually packing up their own goods. There will certainly be some costs associated for our custodians to pack or unpack, and then of course the movers themselves. And I think we had experience going back to our days from being in Brookfield. It was between $12,000 and $15,000 per move, as we had understood going back to those experiences. Build an additional $100,000 for Danbury High School cafeteria tents and supervision. John is still exploring some other ways to possibly offset this cost. He thinks there may be some ways to talk with our federal lunch programs to address this cost. But until we have some clarification there, we are anticipating supervision of tents during inclement weather. And the actual, now this cost is an estimate with leased tents, not purchased ones. If we were to purchase them, certainly it would reduce the cost, but then of course we would have to maintain them and have the insurance associated with that. So we will, one way or the other, we will have two probably numbers for the board to look at and consider, and we'll get some feedback on what the best way to approach this. But we are anticipating around $100,000 for tents to address the overflow from the cafeteria out to the courtyard, so we can cover those areas, particularly as we get to those months of inclement weather. Once we have the inclement weather, the tents have to be closed in, they have to be heated. Once those shades are down, we have to pay someone to supervise inside of each individual tent that might be out there. Of course, that would more than likely be teaching staff, but not necessarily. So our budget projections, of course, will assume that it's teaching staff. So those are the numbers that we'll be based on. The next few bullets provide staffing history and new position analysis. This is typical of our budgets in previous years. And so when I say provide staffing history, we'll kind of go year over year, for 2 or 3 years, look back to find out, to get an idea of how much it's costing the district for 24-25 versus 23-24 versus 22-23. And then we will do something similar where we can provide what ECS funding looks like, spending and enrollment comparison report. And so last year, and I know 2 years previously, we had done a comparison with our districts that are similar to us. And so oftentimes in this room, I'll talk about Norwalk and Stanford, but there are other districts like East Haven and East Hartford and Meriden and other districts that also look like us. And so we want to make sure we can provide a fair comparison for the board to see how we're spending locally, the state monies that we get and what these other districts get as well, just so the board can have an idea of what it looks like across the system. provide key departmental budget drivers, and so we'll break down, you've seen a lot of summaries on these lines. And so John had talked about the high school and all of the positions. Right now, you just see the aggregate 1 million, so we'll make sure we have that detailed out for you for every line item. And so I just want you to know that's something you should anticipate. And last but not least, and this is something we have not done my first 2 years as a superintendent, and that's provide a full financial summary of general and grants funding. We think it's really important that the board and the community understands it takes a little over $220+ million to fully operate the school district, in which we rely on $50+ million of grants plus our general operating budget. We will make sure we have a visual. We're going to do the best we can to have a visual to help folks understand that the operational serves one purpose, and there's kind of an overlay, and maybe we'll have a 3D out where this is the grants piece that's serving the other purpose. The grants are intentional, meaning the expectation is they are to, as my assistant superintendents remind me all the time, the grants are purposeful in that they are to address interventions for students, they are to address achievement gap for students, they are to address related services and mandated service for kids, whether that's Title III, Title IV, IDEA, Alliance, etc. titles. And so we're mindful of that, but we also want to share with you that we have staff in those grants. And we want to make sure we do a better job of making it clear to you who those people are, the type of positions that we've had in these grants that frankly, we've relied on these grants to operate the district for years. And one of them that I think I've repeated a few times, full day kindergarten is not a requirement. Full day K, half day K is a requirement. And so years ago, as a strategy, Danbury Public Schools decided to put their kindergarten teachers in the Alliance grant. And so now, to date, years later, we have 47 kindergarten teachers taking up space, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but they are taking up a significant space in Alliance as a strategy for Danbury Public Schools. So these are the type of things we want to make sure is clear to the board, and why it will be so important we count on those Alliance monies. Certainly, and what I will share with you in the next slide, we are expecting, and as you recall from our last meeting, some anticipated supplemental funding streams for the 24-25 school year. Very excited, I'll say it again, very excited to be part one of two to be fully funded with our Alliance funding. And this comes at a really good time, as certainly we are experiencing some expiring monies from COVID relief. But our Alliance right now is beginning to kick in, and in 2 years we will be fully funded. The expectation is we'll go from 22 million in 2023 right now, 23-24 right now. By 26-27, we should be at $34 million. So it will grow $12 million over the next 2 years. Great for Danbury, we need it. The money should have been here yesterday, but okay. And next year, that number is projected to be around $29 million. And so I just wanted to bring your attention to it. So I just wanted to make sure I bring to your attention, these are the anticipated supplemental monies we are expecting next year. We are anticipating LEAP 1 and 2 to continue again next year. And I'm sorry, but I can't, I have the reserves in there because whether it's now or later, our intention is certainly to request the reserves of $5 million that accumulated during the pandemic. And I'll just say quickly about that, probably John should also have this in our full presentation on the 10th. Pre-pandemic, we had approximately $2.5 to $3 million in the reserves. In the IBNR, I don't remember exactly what it's for. John can help me out with that, but I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
Health insurance.
All right, and so it was a health insurance kind of requirement that we had to have in there as part of the reserves. And so we would continue to maintain that health insurance reserves, and still we would have $5.8 million additional that has been accumulated on top of that. And so this is a long way of saying we have about $8.8 million in the reserves right now. If we left $3 million in the reserves to cover the health insurance kind of requirement or best practice, that would still leave us with $5.8 million. And so as of right now, again, I know we still have an outstanding request from last school year to tap the reserves for right now. Right now, this presentation is anticipating we're not going to get that request. And so that's why you're seeing up here a request for $5 million for the reserves. So I don't want you to think I'm double counting the $3 million plus the $5 million. I understand. I love to count them both, but we can't. And so this $5 million is expecting that we're not getting it, and the $5 million is on the board as a strategy for the 24-25 budget. And so that is it for us, but I did want to bring it to your attention. We are planning to make sure our next presentation includes the things that are on slide 12. And I want to leave this up here because I intend there might be some questions. But I also want to make sure I walk away this evening with if there's something you want to see in the next presentation. I wanted to make sure the team and I, and we're taking notes to make sure we capture what you want to see, because I want to make sure the presentation captures what the board is hoping to see. And for Chair Cooper, that is it for our presentation. We're open for any questions right now.
Are there any questions? Could you raise your hand? Louisa?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The money that you have put aside for the tents, is that still going to be needed once the academy opens?
No.
So John, I would like you to answer that question. I just want to say one thing. I just want to clarify, we don't have any money on the side, Louisa.
Well, you know what I mean.
Yes, but John, please go ahead.
Yeah, the tents are primarily for lunch. With that number of students, with 3,900 students, you just can't get them through the cafeteria in 4 waves. We need more room. They don't want to have the students eating somewhere else other than a situation where it can be monitored.
Right, so we're anticipating that as a one-year strategy.
Okay, that's what I'm answering.
Because we anticipate, this is really because the building is not open.
Right,
We need tents for the overflow because there's just too many kids in the cafeteria.
thank you.
Thank you.
I had Mr. Janelli, and then it would be Teresa, and then Mr. Harley.
I've got several questions. I'll just go through them if it's okay.
Could we do 2 questions at a time?
Sure.
Okay, and then we come back and let the other board members go, and then you can come back with your second question. Could you put it in the form of a question, not a statement from here to New York? Okay, a question. Thank you.
You're really killing me. With regard to the charts on the enrollment increase,
Could you speak into your mic, Mr. Janella? We can barely hear you. What page you
on your, what page? On your page, where's the buttons here? There we go. Are they on? That's it. Yeah, we're good. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
On your page 3, you show an enrollment growth. When I look at this, I see that the overall growth over the period of the 8 years was some 800 and some odd students. When I look at the other charts following that, that is the enrollment growth having to do with the MLO and the special ed, there are also increases. The MLL increase went up to some 1,400 students. Looked like an increase of some 45%, and special ed students went up. Can I assume that in the enrollment growth on per schedule here for the total for the district, the growth over the past 8 years, we're really only in 3 years, but would that be an assumption that the enrollment we have in our district is coming principally from the body of MLL and to a small degree from special ed?
Very small degree special education. The multi-language learner enrollment growth has been like no other district in the state of Connecticut. To a small extent Meriden, but we're really the only 2 in the state of Connecticut that's experiencing this type of percentage enrollment growth. And yes, I don't know exactly the number, Mr. Chinelli, but a significant percentage of our enrollment growth has been indeed multi-language learners.
Okay, so it's a valid assumption. The second question I have, I'll refer to the page here. Where I don't follow your, it's your page called the clip.
Okay.
I don't see the page. It's page number 6. Okay. On your 24-25 column, your last number says funding needed 169 million. Do I take that to mean that that's your operating lights on budget related to, in your other schedules here, the number now is 160 million. It was previously 163. So what's the disparity?
I'll take a jump. If I get it wrong, you can jump in. So this 169 is representing a couple of things. It is representing keep the lights on going from 150 to 160, but it's also representing the salaries folded in from the expired ESSER 3. So if you look at 23-24, we have that number sitting at the top, 11.4. And so this chart really is really saying, hey, that 11.4 has to go somewhere. And so now we're sliding the 11.4 over and folding into the general budget. And so now that budget goes from 160 to 169, and it's right from last year's budget. I'm sorry, from last year's budget, 22, 23 to 23, 24.
This was our projection from last year at this time.
Right, this is an excerpt from the book from last year, so this is
I
not
just-
current right now.
I just follow the, I find it confusing to follow that. In terms of, if you're gonna call something one place, then be consistent, call it the same thing some other place. Because, I mean, I would look at this at some point in time and try to trace the number without any explanation to say, why are you 160 or 163 versus 169? So there has to be some sort of a footnote. Or adjust one of your schedules to reflect the numbers so that they're comparable to do it. I mean, it's, later on I'll get the other questions with regard to that. But that's just an
Okay.
observation where it becomes confusing.
Right, that's fair, and I think this is,
Because
when we are looking at the orange column, when we developed this budget book, we were in the gray, right? So 22, 23, we were in November, December in the gray at that time. And at that point, we were projecting not what it would look like in 23, 24, but what it would look like in 24, 25, 2 years ahead of where we were at that time. And what we were trying to project was, well, basically from what John was talking about earlier, basically our keep the lights on maintenance budget going from year over year, year over year. And what you're seeing, that 169 here reflective of maintenance budget, rolling it over 2 times, 23, 24, 24, 25, and then folding in 11.4. So we understand it's not going to necessarily line up exactly with our real ask now, because we know it doesn't represent the new staff, which we did not anticipate, because we didn't want to try to project what enrollment growth would look like and what Dan and the system's ask might be. But what we did try to do was really, this slide was really about, listen, we had the conversation about the cliff. And that's the reason why we brought this slide back in, to say this is not the first time we talked about the financial cliff approaching. That was really the intentionality behind it. But you're absolutely right, the numbers don't match. And I can see how that can be confusing for someone who doesn't understand that the intentionality about bringing people's attention back to it was just to say, this is not the first time we've had the conversation about the cliff. And that's really the intention about it. And I don't know if John and I did a good enough job about that's why we're talking about it. That's really the intentionality.
You're building in a history which is not privy to people, I don't mean me personally, but
Right.
you're gonna make this a presentation to another audience, who again is gonna be a good part of that audience, is not gonna have the history
Got it.
of many people here, or what you're supposing that they have behind it. And I said to you before, I do like the concept relative to the 3 components of your budget. The keeping the lights on, I like that phraseology. The loss of funding, the ESSA money, and your new needs. And that's why, when I looked at it, I says, okay, how much does he need? Does he need the $170 million, because that's what I would put in there, or whatever that final number is,
Right.
the all-inclusive number. And somebody can say, okay, what is that made up of? And you can go to your last page, and it's boom, boom, boom.
Okay, fair.
You know, without a long explanation as to what you gave to
Okay.
that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I do have more questions, but
Okay.
that's the first two.
Teresa?
Thank you. My first question is, I understand there's new legislation coming down the pike. Are we being mindful of those costs?
I'm sorry, Teresa, which legislation?
New legislation? It's coming down the pike?
Yeah, I think there's some sort of LEAP program that, or there's also climate change administrator that's being looked at as a mandate for 24-25. Is that something that we would be looking into now?
Now, who's asking the question?
Well, this was are we ever mindful of future in the past, it doesn't seem we have been mindful of what's coming down the pipe in the legislature. And I was just wondering if we are paying attention.
I will make sure that I speak with my team to incorporate any legislation that might impact the budget for sure.
Thank you.
I.e. kindergarten legislation recently,
Yeah.
right?
And my second question was, moving costs, is that an estimate or did you get a quote for $100,000?
It's a rough estimate based on some activity we've already had in the district.
Yeah, but that's in the past, the costs have gone up.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And this was an estimate for this presentation. We'll have something tighter by the time we're back here for January 10th. for sure.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Michelle, and then Mr. Hall.
Jeez. I had so many questions that I've written down. So when you were talking about the salaries and then
Michelle, can you turn your mic on?
it's on. Oh, can you hear me? Get closer. When you were talking about adding the tutors, the 4 million over to the salaries, and then you brought it back up again. In other words, I think it was in the new school, in the career academy, that we needed, 2 extra people or principals or administrators, and then all the additional staff that you read off, which I would love to have a copy of to see where we're lacking instruction in each school. That would be great. Is that part of the number that you've already allocated here, these positions, like these requests for all these additional teachers? Is that in the proposed budget for the spring?
It is. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, like, have we included all those positions in the number that you're saying is 400,000 for special ed in the spring? And, like these numbers, you read off a lot of teaching under the Alliance Fund, however we're gonna do it. Are those all included in these figures in the spring?
They are, and we like to show the new positions isolated and separate so we can zero right in on exactly what's changing. Remember the chart that had the 3 amounts, the 160, the second amount was the ESSER 3. We're not talking about those as new positions, although they might be new to the school budget. Those are teachers that have been here for a couple of years. But it's that third section that has all of the new positions, including the ones I read off. And one of the things on our to-do list for next week is to show you exactly those in a better summary fashion.
Right, so Michelle, so for example, I'm looking at slide 10. I know I don't have that on the page, but it's budget drivers 3 of 3. And John was going into detail about the new positions for the school, during the spring transition, et cetera. And so what I'm hearing from John is we will have detailed what those positions are. Because right now we just have it in the aggregate and the summative. And I know the board is used to seeing, okay, this is how many core teachers, what core teachers? English, math, science, social studies. So we'll have a breakdown for you. So you can see how we got to the $1 million and that $1,050,000 for Danbury High School. And then what that also means for academic support. So John was beginning to give some 3 middle school,
Right.
English, and Spanish and Portuguese. So we'll have that detail as well to come up with the other $1 million.
So when we had spoken 2 years ago about overages, that was a big issue regarding covering classes. I think we had 56. You said this year that it was reduced. I don't think we got a number, but the number I believe you said went down about 200K. Is that considered in this budget as well? Overages, or these added teachers take care or address any of that expense that we
Yes,
just have?
So the overages, I mentioned the substitute costs of Kelly Services, but that number also includes the overages. So the overages are being paid out of the ESSER 3 grant, and we're proposing that they come over to the school budget as part of the, I think it's 2.4 million we put up there to bring over.
And that's just my last question, and I have some more. You had mentioned the one-to-one computer, for the district, and I saw that number, it looks like it's 1.2 million or something, is that right? Is that on a separate line item?
785,000.
Okay.
On slide 10.
So I guess, yeah, because I saw that number in two places. So is that going to be a capital budget improvement as it was originally discussed at the end of?
No, this is in addition to the capital budget that we've submitted.
So under the capital budget, we've got 1.2 million for a one-to-one, and then I think it was
I
like
believe so.
400 or something thousand for staff support. And now you're saying that we're gonna need on top of that this
No,
number?
Michelle, you're right.
I'm just trying to
Because
figure out
no,
where
I
we're
know.
putting these
And
one-to-one.
Mike, is there some distinction you can provide? Because I think when we provide our full presentation, we may need like a slide that shows, hey, this is for the general operating budget, and by the way, this is gonna go to the capital, but do you have something you can share? So
Yeah, which slide
clarification.
specifically was it?
Gosh,
Well, she's talking about the 785,000 now.
yeah,
The
it's
technology.
listed.
Right, but she's recalling, appropriately so, that we had a lot of things from technology in the capital budget, i.e.
Yeah.
copy machines.
We did, yeah.
I.e., right. And I just don't remember offhand exactly what those were, I don't know if you have some of those.
Right, the technology that was in capital. I'm bad, I don't know about it. The technology that was in capital was for Chromebook refresh. It was a lot of technology. Chromebook refreshes, teacher Chrome MacBook refreshes, copiers and printers were in there, and then a few other things, converting our phone system to voice over internet protocol, and then additional security measures. There's a few services that we've taken on since last year's incident, and then also something for a website rebuild. We have to move the high school website off the old server onto a new server. So that's within the capital budget. This is separate and distinct. This is more
Okay,
for-
so it's additional.
This is,
because obviously-
making our network more robust and our whole network infrastructure.
Because I'm just trying to figure out, we know that AI is coming, we obviously are trying to up, our game on technology, but obviously this would be the first time that we would be considering that kind of money in that fashion for the capital budget. For what in the past would have been pencils and paper is now technology. We need to repair our schools, obviously that was the intent, plumbing, elevators, we all speak that language here, floods. So I'm just concerned about that high number, plus all of the ones that we have, and we're gonna be bringing on that new school. So just wanna make sure that we have an understanding of what those numbers are.
Right.
And I know that last year we had saved some money projecting on, this is totally a sidebar, on health insurance. So I'm a little concerned that we are making that, I almost feel like we're back in time repeating, like, I think we're gonna do better on our utility and our insurance. And that I'm a little weary about that, because at the ad hoc meeting, I thought they said that we could not draw less, we had to have $5 million in our healthcare benefit account. You're saying that there's 8.8 and that we would have access to $5 million? My recall on that ad hoc meeting, if you remember, we had to have like $5 million, I think we had like 585, so we had like 80-something thousand. So I don't know, did that change with the insurance where now you're saying we only need 3 million in the reserves instead of 5 million, which was a number that I remember at the ad hoc, or Fox was kind of holding on to that $5 million number. We only had like 85 to draw. without being impacted. So I'm wondering how we went to 3 million if that's a new negotiation. And then I'm done. Thank you.
So the amount of the reserves and the individual reserves are set by the city finance department along with the city council. And there is a requirement that if you are self-insured, like we are, you have to keep, I think it's 6 weeks of average claims on reserve. That's what you keep hearing about. That's the IBNR, incurred but not realized, is what it stands for. Any other amounts that you keep in reserve, what this finance department tries to do, and other well-run finance departments, they want to keep monies for other things to the extent that it's reasonable. So, there's a little bit of money for workers' comp claim that might be crazy, or some unemployment situation that might be unexpected. And the reason they like to keep those other amounts, and the reason to keep reserves, is it looks good to the rating agencies when they come in to rate our bonds or notes when we're borrowing. They don't just look at the surplus that you have, the fund balance, I say they, the city, but they look at the way you're also managing your balance sheet, and they look favorably when there's reserves set aside versus if they're not. But so what they're doing is they're trying to balance these things. What's needed for the operation, what's good for the rating agency, where's the kind of the middle ground. We haven't heard anything other than what we heard at the ad hoc in October, to be a little more specific.
Because we're adding staff, so I'm only assuming that those claims have a potential to be higher than less. So I'm just wondering, maybe we have a new benefits coordinator who's, found a new program, but that just brings some concern to me, because that's where we ran into problems last year.
We do think though, and Gallagher, our consultant, would agree, that we had a very unusual situation last spring. It really, call it post-pandemic. There were a lot of claims. People began to go back to the doctor, back to the hospital. They didn't want to do that when COVID was raging. And when those folks, in simple terms, when many of them did go back, their situations were more advanced than they had been if they had been gotten there. And so we think we had an abnormal jump in some high-cost claims, and we're not seeing those repeat yet. So fingers crossed.
Thank you.
Mr. Hawley, before you ask your question, I'm just going to ask that we be respectful of other time and the questions, and if another board member does not have a question, then we can come back and you can ask your follow-up questions, okay? I don't want to have anyone say that I'm letting someone else ask 3 or 4 questions. I think 2 questions we can start off, and then your other question we can go around. So, Mr. Hall.
So thank you, Madam Chair. So if I look at page 3, you're noticing, or you're signifying basically an enrollment increase of 186 students from 23-24 to 24-25. Is that correct? From 12-2 to 12-3-91.
Yes, based on the.
So 200 students of an increase, plus adding 2 schools, yet you're only adding 14 staff members, to the best of my knowledge from looking at page 10. I mean, how can that be?
I'm sorry, could you re-ask the question?
So again, if we're adding approximately 200 students to our enrollment for school year 24-25,
Right.
how is it that we're only adding 14 staff members, which is predominantly going toward DHS and Academy, as well as opening 2 schools to satisfy not only the increased enrollment, but opening of 2 schools? How could that staffing level be that small? I'm mildly surprised.
Right, I guess I'm not understanding the opening up 2 schools part of the 24.
Well, I mean, you're opening Academy is what, you're opening the Academy, correct? which I consider as two schools, a middle and a high.
Okay, but that's not for the 24-25 budget. That's for 25-26. So what John was talking about was having administrators in place to help open up that school for planning for the summer. So that's what he's referring to, a middle school administrator to be ready, hired in the spring, to open up the doors for planning. And then also someone, whoever's gonna be on the new site, an administrator to also help open the doors for planning. And of course, that's up to the board to determine whether or not that's something we want to agree to in terms of a strategy.
Okay, so my misinterpretation,
No,
thank
it's
you.
okay.
And then secondly, if I could ask, where was it? My apologies, I'll defer, I'll
We'll come back.
So now,
If you think about it, you can.
Yeah.
Comes up. Mr. Janelle, oh, I'm sorry, Teresa,
Just, we had
I'm sorry.
gone to the ad hoc committee for $3.5 million for the new reading program. What's the status on that? That was supposed to come out of the reserve?
yes.
We didn't go to the ad hoc for the reading program, although we talked about it in this context. The reading program, we used the expiring ESSER 2 grant primarily for that. And it was $3 million. We didn't want any ESSER money going back to the federal government, and the mandate was there. But what we talked about with the ad hoc was that because we chose the reading program, that took away some options to use those funds for other things, and we hadn't expected that until recently. That's the word. But Kara, I don't know if you want to add any update to the reading program.
No, I think you described it accurately, that it was purchased with ESSER 2 funds, and that grant was specifically meant for, closing gaps,
That's right.
pandemic-related issues.
Can I ask? That wasn't my understanding. We were going there for the new reading program, and they asked you, when did they have to know, what was it, by spring, whether or not we needed that money? So you decided to go the ESSER route. I was not aware of that. It was all regards to the new reading program, which I'm glad. I'm just trying to clarify. There's been gaps since we last talked. Thank you.
Mr. Hall, yes, go ahead.
If I may, do you have a wish budget? I mean, this, as you mentioned, is kind of our bare bones, keep the
It is.
keep the windows and,
All the way.
so where, do we have a wish budget?
I think it's important for us, and I'm glad you asked it that way, because I think it's important, as my folks are over here smiling, looking at me, I think it's important that our January 10th requests represent what we really need, because what we're presenting to the board is really bare bones just to get by. And as an example, and this is just one example, John's recommendation for 4 additional buses is just enough. It's just enough. It does not address the request for, as we met with parents, that Dr. Mead set up for me to meet with parents during the month of December, when families are saying, my kid can't get a bus to go to practice unless my child is on the football team or the basketball team, but if my kid is in band, if my kid is in one of these other sports that is not one of the 2 major sports, my kid can't get a bus because all the buses are on the final run for the elementary schools. Never mind the non-pubs, right? And that's a whole other story. I know we've had that conversation in this room. But my regular extracurricular activities, we don't have enough buses just to address those needs. So right now, as an example, this request still doesn't cover those families' requests. Making sure that our kids can have buses for transportation, something as simple, I don't want to say simple, but something as typical as making sure all of our kids have the necessary transportation for after-school activities. So I think it's going to be important. I'll make sure that we write this down as we're talking about it, because as my assistant superintendent is over here smiling. But not just transportation. Our budget request for security is just enough. I don't think we can find enough advocates or budget for enough advocates that we're really going to need for a building of 3,900. Our request for class size at that high school for 3,900 kids is just addressing Dan's number for 26, 27, 28 kids in the classroom. What it really should be is 25, 26. That makes more sense. Just enough is really just keeping our numbers at 26, 27, 28 in our middle schools, which we all know is way too high. But the reality is, if we wanted to hire an additional section at the middle schools, there's no room to put them. Like, if we wanted to hire math, English, science, and social studies and open up a new section at Rogers Park Middle School, Chrissy doesn't have room for a new English, math, science, and social studies in another section in that building. Although she'd probably find it if I said you can get 5 extra teachers. So I will make sure when my team and I come back with the January 10th budget, and I appreciate the challenge, that it's really a little bit more representative of the numbers we feel like we should be at versus the numbers just enough to get by. And so I appreciate you asking that question that way, because I think it's important for us to be mindful of that ask when we're coming back with not the non-preliminary budget, but the budget that the superintendent is asking the board to approve. So thank you for asking me that.
Okay,
Can I just ask a clarifying question about the reserve funds? So is the plan to not try to draw down those reserve funds that we had already requested from council for this year and ask for the $5 million for next year? Maybe I'm missing something in translation.
No, thank you, Kate. We have, and in fact, I just received an email. I don't recall what day it is. I'll make sure it's in the update to the board at the end of the week. Received an email for an invitation, I believe it's next week, to meet with the ad hoc committees. I believe all 3 ad hocs on one day next week, or it's the week after. It's one of those days. And it is the 17th, thank you, John. And it is to review the request from last year that the board made on the district's behalf. So we will be there for those requests. If the requests are honored, then we will accept the monies and pay for whatever is outstanding for this year and speak with the board and talk about a strategy for 24-25. If the requests are not honored, we will move the request forward for the 24-25 school year and keep that as a strategy. But this budget's proposal assumed we were not getting it, given it's already January. Assumed that we were not getting it, and I hate to say it that way, but that's just where we were when we were putting this together. Assumed that we were not going to get it, and our strategy was to request $5 million of what we anticipate 5.8 being available for 24-25 school year.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Ms. Harris?
Yes.
Thank you.
Superintendent.
Yes,
In the original November
yes.
preliminary budget, there was a page in there that I would just suggest that you continue to use, and that was the budget priorities,
Oh,
which makes it, to me, it communicates what you have or what you're going to present and how you're going to support. Does that make sense?
yes it does, yes it does,
So
yes it does.
Question number 2, and again, remember I'm new, so I'm the one that's gonna ask all the questions. On page number 6, for the Title I, we used to have Title I schools, now we're a Title I district, is that correct?
That is correct, except for Danbury High School.
Yes, somebody say yes.
In our
no?
programs.
Yes, right? Okay, good, that helps me with when I talk about the funding. And so my very last question is on page 10. And talking about the staff for the academy. And I think you said that you will detail who the request is,
Yes.
right? When we're talking about hiring new people into those positions, is that right? So we don't currently have,
I think will of course be following the collective bargaining agreement, but they are new positions that will be created, we hope to create.
And Juanita, I just want to make sure you're referring to academy staff salary spring transition?
Salaries, benefits, spring transition.
Okay. And just to clarify for everyone, in the event we can open up, no, I'm sorry. When we open up 2526, a new building, we anticipate having 2 schools within that building. A school that's going to serve 912 and a school that's going to serve 68. And John, as part of his preparation, is anticipating if there's going to be a middle school there, we're going to need a new middle school administrator to get a schedule ready, to get however we're going to get kids into that building. That administrator would be hired and preparing to open the doors for this summer. And so that's why he's budgeting for a spring transition, whatever that might be decided. And then the same is also true of a new person, and this is the conversation Teresa was debating prior to our break. And this is the idea currently as part of our organization chart. There would be a principal with 2 academies, or a head principal, and then an assistant principal in charge of 2 academies at the building. But that principal of that site at this moment is not on staff. And so those are the 2 positions that John is referring to.
Mr. Jadella, did you want to follow your question?
Thank you. And to be technical, I have 3 statements and 2 questions. Statement number 1, to John's point. There was an article, again, I think it was January 1st, and has to deal with the enrollment. Danbury is going through a proposed building surge in apartments. The article read that Summit's looking to put in 200 apartments. Mill Plate Road, Al Salem's place is looking for another 100 or some odd apartments. Downtown between Maloney and somebody else is looking for more apartments, Bertram. Now, to your point, Kevin, when your demographers come in and do these assessments, are they taking into account the potential of these apartments with enrollment? And what the impact may be on the students? It's just a statement. Number 2, I would be cautious and just caution you to be conservative on utilizing the reserves, only because of the history of the insurance, the uncertainty of self-insurance and the numbers. So you don't want to be back a couple of years from now in the same boat. But again, that's a statement. And my final statement is, John, when you go to restate some of these schedules, if you would not only restate the current one, but the prior years as well, so they make sense. And also, if you can give an addendum to those line numbers, to the point where you mentioned this includes the buses and this includes 14 FTEs. If you can have, you can note it, line number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then have an addendum includes 14, and it gives a narrative. And what I'm getting at, it makes the numbers more meaningful and digestible for somebody reading it, so that nobody's going to sit there and scribe, and I don't think any one of us took down all those copious notes that made up the numbers. So I think that's something. My 2 questions are as follows, one of which I think Kevin answered, but the first one I'll ask is, Kevin, on your slide where you say where you indicate, and it's a factual indicator, that we were shorted some $44 million. My question would be, what was the impact on the education in Danbury of that shortage? How did that impact us? What effect did that have on the teachers, the students, the administration? My next question is, and part of which Richard asked, and I think you answered. The budget you're providing, I was going to ask you, is this total budget of $170 million a business as usual budget? In other words, where are you showing me or the community that for the $170 million, in addition to keeping up with growth, using that, and other nuances that we have to keep up with, such as the academy, et cetera, et cetera. But you're measured at different points, and it comes out, and you have periodic meetings with academic achievements. Where in that $170 million can you say that that's going to affect a decline in the achievement gap, or that's going to give me the opportunity to have improvements in my different testing scores? You're the one that's on the hook for the academic performance. You're on the hook for everything, but it depends on which hook, they want to burn you on, so to say. But and to Richard's point, I've always thought that the purpose of us here is to present a budget, not to placate, and I use that word not in a derogatory sense, okay, but to put a budget forth that's going to move this district ahead with what you need, and then given the appropriations on that, you're justified in saying, okay, with that, I don't have 22 kids in the class. I've got 27 kids, so I see what the impact is. That's what I was trying to get at, and I think your answer to Richard was that this total budget of $170 million, basically, what I would put is the maintenance budget to keep the lights on, if I understand it correctly.
It is, Mr. J.
So would it be prudent to put together something that you could say, maybe there's 180, 190 million, and it's going to move this district ahead because of the challenges we have, rather than people think that you're going to do that, and you come back at some point and say, well, I don't have the funds, I can't do that. How can I increase my scores when I got 28 kids that I hypothetically in a class? It's impossible for me to do that. That's the second question that I have, is to perhaps we should think about what we're proposing and what the scenario, what foot we want to put forward in the district.
I appreciate you breaking it down that way. My short, quick answer will be, not sure you wanted an answer, but what you just asked is certainly going to inform our January 10th presentation. But I will also say, because you had asked the question, well, by that $43 million gap, since 17-18, what has this district missed? And so I will start with, I worked in Norwalk once upon a time. Yes, we have more multilingual learner students than they did when I was in Norwalk, and the same is still true. But the profile of the student is not terribly different outside of that. In Norwalk Public Schools, graduation rate is at 90. We are at 80. The supports across that building are broken down in a way where kids have support, class sizes are reasonable at 24 and 25, when Dan would do backflips for 24 and 25 across the school. Elementary schools with supports at kindergarten. This district hasn't seen supports in kindergarten classrooms. I don't think they've had kindergarten supports in classrooms since I know they haven't since I've been here. We know the history of what it would mean for K1 and 2 and investing in those early years, the difference that can make in the projections, what that can mean for how a kid might project when they get to 3, 4, and 5. Instead, our class size, particularly when we've experienced enrollment bumps in this district, because It didn't start at middle school and high school, it was in elementary school at first. And so we were at 24 and 25, and teachers complaining about class size then. We've come back from the pandemic, and our staff across the system is saying our children are different, the needs are different across the system. Meanwhile, as a district, we're asking just for enough to get by, when we know we need more. And so the idea, and so the guide, kind of the guardrails on class size are 22, K1, 2, and 3. We really don't want any more than 22. To try to maintain that, Mr. Hawley, is going to actually cost more than I'm asking for right now, to be frank. 4 and 5, we try to stay at 25. But if you ask my elementary teachers, they're going to go, Kevin, are you crazy? Like, this is not the same district that it was prior to the pandemic. And meanwhile, my kindergarten teachers who I know, I don't want to say I know them well, but I know them differently before the pandemic because I was in several meetings with them during the pandemic, all 47 of them in a remote meeting. And it was clear, Kevin, we need help in our classrooms. And so you're talking about $40-something million gap. This system should have always had someone in those classrooms when a third of the kids in your room do not speak English. They should have always been there. And by the way, they're 5 and 6, and in some cases 4. Right? We already know that's been the reality in Danbury Public Schools, some other districts as well. And then in a district where a third of our kids do not speak the language, that's all the more reason to have a class size that's manageable across this system. And so again, Mr. Hall, again, I appreciate you asking the question the way you did. And I think, Mr. Gillette, when we put our budget request together, I think 175, 178 million, people need to understand, well, this is what you're getting for 178. And if you're not happy with that, then it's going to mean 190 if you want class size to look like this, et cetera. And so, and maybe that's not the way we should do it, but I'm just an opener to just kind of open up the dialogue.
I think we're constantly looking.
Excuse me. Oh, okay. Are you continuing the question?
That was a response
Okay.
to Kevin. I think we're constantly asked to make lemonades out of lemon and to have the district, its administrators, its teachers, and its students suffer because of much of what you had explained. And I think by putting our foot forward and saying, if you want this district to be like a Norwalk and have this, then this is what I need to run this particular district. Because when the test scores come out and Karen W. comes up and gives all of her statistics and supported by Kara and then Kelly, we're backpedaling. And it's like saying, I don't have the money, but now is at the time when we say, this is where we should be. If you can't afford to give it to me, this is what you're going to expect. So that we put it out there as to what the impact, and I keep using that word strongly, what the impact of not supporting the education budget is going to be on Danbury. Because, to your point, over the years, the district demographics has changed, the needs of the students has changed, and we've got to change with that, and that's a financial change. So, that's, I agree with Richard. It is, and with you for saying that, to propose a budget that is going to be able to let you do your job and not be held accountable with your hands tied for something that you can't do.
Our teachers and staff agree.
Michelle, one question.
That's it. I'm looking at page 6, where we look at the other grants, and I'm looking forward to the next meeting where you're gonna break down all those grants and how long they are for and all that good stuff. But this number is consistent, 34 million, just across the board for 3 years. Is that just the general number that you've taken?
It was at that time.
Because that, with all the, Career Academy and all that, and I know that we've really kind of exponentially really grown
For sure.
our nonprofit. So since I've been here, I've seen a lot of growth, but that number hasn't moved. So hopefully there's more in the Kitty, when you come back.
We will be able to
That
show.
that what we're seeing
Absolutely.
and what we're looking to get our hands on for the new school. We're gonna have to really make sure that we maximize the grants. I don't know, who's responsible for that. I know Ann does a lot of it for what we currently have, but when we go for the Career Academy, and we're talking about the mentors and the partnerships and the grants and those, like, is John you that you're gonna be working in and trying to get grant money and whatever, sponsors, whatever it is to maybe increase our numbers if possible?
Right. So there are competitive grants that is annually available to us as a district. And then there are competitive grants that folks in this room, vast majority of people in this room who are going out there trying to find them, meaning Dr. Casimiro and Kelly Trucius in this room who are going out and seeking out those grants. And so, like, annually available in an e-grant system that we have to apply for every year, but they're sustainable. But then there are other grants that we go out and try to bring additional resources and monies into this district. And, well, really, quite frankly, Ann, Karen, Kelly, the people who are going out to get those grants. So I'll make sure they provide a kind of overview. I think it's important that we be able to talk about kind of the intentionality behind the grants, but also the restrictions. Because some of them are, I don't want to say wide open, but like aligned in Title and Title 1, 2, 3, 4. We have flexibility for staffing, et cetera. But then there's some other grants like the BAR grant that we've heard about, the Nellie Mae grant, not necessarily staffing, but initiative kind of driven. And those things will address professional development, resources, speakers coming in and stuff, but not necessarily people. So we'll try to talk about that as well. Yes, absolutely.
Just attack from every area
That's
to
right.
get money.
But the important thing, we don't have to go through the regular budget to go get that stuff. We can
Right.
pull it from a grant. So
I'm hoping.
it all helps.
Yeah, I'm hoping that number is higher, that, if
We'll
we
leave
just took a
it to
general
speak to it.
line, maybe we can get some money.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
John, I have a question on the budget drivers on page 3, where there's all new costs. And I think you said next week when we have our board workshop, you're gonna be able to fill in and give us more information on that page.
Yes, and I think
Page
that's,
10.
that's what Mr. Janelli was asking for,
Yes.
too. I wrote it down.
Yeah. So
We'll
we're
have
gonna bring
the
that
items
in.
that make up those.
So you can see the names of the positions.
Okay,
et
so
cetera,
we
right?
have that next week, so
Yes.
you don't have to worry about emailing it to anyone tomorrow. We'll
Okay.
have that at the budget meeting on next week,
Yes.
okay?
Thank you.
To board members, you were asked to fill out your top priorities as a board member for 2024. I only received 4. I only received 6. So I have some people that need to contact Carol because that's gonna help us stay focused as a group and work together so we can understand what our top priorities are. And we know from what I have so far, from the 6 people that filled theirs out, the top priority is the budget right now. So they just asking you to list your top 4 priorities as a board member for 2024.
I don't think I understood that.
I don't think I understood, I'm sorry, I don't think I understood the
Yeah.
email, so I'll
Okay,
get that.
so anything that you don't understand, you can call
Yeah.
me, text me, or call Carol, and we'll make sure that everyone get the information. Okay.
Top four
I'll have
priorities.
Kara send
Yeah, what are your
resend something
top
out
four-
and clarify.
Top 4 priority as a board member,
Sorry,
and no one sees it
Confused with
except.
committees.
yeah.
I think I got it confused with the committees and then another thing came out with others, and I think
Yeah.
that's where I might have
Yeah, me
gotten
too. Right.
caught up there somewhere.
No problem. Yes.
You've also asked us about the district.
I can't hear
committee-
you, Mark.
The district committees and the PTO.
Yes, I
meetings.
have all that signed up. I will have that. I will do it next
Is it
week
by
at our
assignment?
workshop. Okay?
Yes.
I want to thank you all for coming. I'm looking forward to working with this group, a great group of people, and we can work together and share our concern and our interests, and we might not all agree, but we won't fight going out the door. Have a good night. I need a motion to adjourn.
Seconded.
Motion made by Kate, seconded by Teresa. All in favor? Aye. Good night, thank you.